Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. In every episode, we will discuss some facet of how RPGs function as modern myths, providing a shared canvas for creativity and the collaborative discovery of new worlds. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net. Episode 6, Exposition, Lore, and Methods of Conveying Information.
Because we are literally talking about some foundations of science fiction writing, right? And so many of them are like, no one else can do that. They did it, and that was fine, but no one else is allowed to do it.
Right, do it the way that author does it.
Right. Yes, lore is awesome. I see so many writers who are writing their own languages, you know what I mean? And it's like,
Tolkien style would really be to write a language and then like have the RPG campaign as an excuse to further develop your language.
Right.
Which I can actually kind of relate with. But
Oh, I love it. I love doing it. I so love doing it. I do it all the time. Linguistics is a huge, one of my many ADD, rabbit holes.
Yeah.
I love it. But it's not.
So let's try to get into it then.
Yeah.
And I guess the top level issue today that we're talking about is exposition, and how to convey information to your players, and also distinguishing kind of the information you're presenting to your players and your characters and the different ways that can play out.
Yeah. So like the baseline, of course, is, as we often talk about, is all of that comes from the GM. Right? The baseline is that there's someone basically talking at the group about X, Y, and Z.
Right.
We're going to use a lot of film examples and such because, let's face it, we're often trying to emulate cinema on some level, right? And so like voiceovers would be the best, idea of like, well, this is this, or sort of like somebody comes upon something and opens up a book and they're like, well, what's the book say?
Right.
Some GMs are going to like literally be like, this is what that book is about, Yeah. Could you imagine your characters coming upon the Silmarillion and being like,
It's a 400.
Yeah.
Yes, and kind of like, how do you want to truncate that information and present it to them in a way that's interesting, right? Found myself dealing with it in different ways, and some work more than others in different situations. But the most obvious way is to just summarize, right? To like kind of move over it quickly, say this is what the book says. We're using that example, and then go on, but doesn't necessarily immerse you in it, especially if the book is actually kind of something that's critical to the to the campaign or to the character. And then at the same time, do you want to hand out a 30-page excerpt of the book? Some players might get something out of that, but not everyone does.
So what are we going to be talking today? We're going to be talking a little bit overall what some of those means of transfer of information are. Where the overarching advice, whether good or ill, will be show, don't tell, and sort of like what that means in each of the pieces. Then we're going to kind of dig into each area that this may impact: character backstory, world lore, out of character information, and then of course the ubiquitous perception check.
Right, and passive perception.
And passive perception, success and failure, those are actually all part and parcel. It's sort of like the tactical to the strategy, right? It's like once you hit the table, perception checks, I feel like, are this really applicable section, right? So first off, we have talked a little bit about what those pieces are. What are some recent points, without necessarily talking about your solutions? What are some of the points that you felt you as a GM needed to convey a certain amount of information?
There's a recent adventure I was running that was, kind of a perfect example of this, where over the course of the campaign, I think that, 21 sessions at that point, there's a sort of developing backstory of this group of revolutionaries, basically, or some sort of organization, called themselves the Circle of Sendir. And finally, we have a session where they encounter the person who organized that order. And at first, they didn't even realize that was who it was. And he has to kind of convey all this information to them, that kind of like fills in the blanks of what they've been, both actively and sort of like, I've been passively, passing on clues. Some of them noticed and some of them not. How to tie that together without that being the entire session.
Right.
In the flow of it, the way, well, I guess you didn't want me to talk about how I dealt with it. Yeah.
No, not yet. Let's just talk about sort of some of the situations, because I know you were telling me earlier that you had a session where basically everybody failed all their perception tests.
Right. Yeah. Or perception, or like optic choices they could have made that would have let them see what was happening in the background of these, basically like the constable of this town had kind of been warned in advance of like caravans coming through and to like hold them up. And so like when they came to him for a pass to perform, their traveling circus right now to perform, he kind of was like, oh, well, yes, but you can't start until next week because of blah, 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 requirement. And they kind of, okay, but there was a chance for them to notice something with a role there behind the scenes. Didn't happen. And it's things like that throughout the session. So then at the very end, it's like some of the people in the circus are kidnapped. And it's like, what happened? And I could just stop at that point and like, they wouldn't know.
They wouldn't know, right? Like that's where right in there. So, and I'm sure we'll probably have an episode about mystery games. I have a lot of opinions about mystery games, but that's another piece of the equation. Clues, right? How do you convey clues and let things move forward? We were talking about Tolkien, right? And lore. We were just listening to Enter the Dungeon, a GMing podcast, and his idea that no one cares about your lore, right? and that's going to break.
I have mixed feelings about
right. It's going to break many GMs' hearts, right? Like, what do you mean you don't care about my lore? And really, interestingly enough, this. Again, we've talked about this, but really kind of digging deeper into this idea that I think the perfect transmission of information, the perfect means by which like a GM's little heart bursts with joy is when your players bring in lore to solve problems. Right. And that's just the sweet spot, right? Like that, I feel like is what I'm always trying to pursue. You know?
Yeah. Although I do like it when they request me to provide them with more lore too after the session. That's the writer's like, okay, here's 20 things.
Yeah. So there's a lot of points, right, where players and then there's also points where players are transmitting information, i.e. who their character is. Right. And we feel like good ways to do this, and maybe there are less effective means to do this, assuming you don't want to just hear the GM prattle on about all of these things, I mean, let's face it, when I don't know, I feel it, and I don't know if you do too, as soon as you said the circle of whatever, my little brain just starts to like tune, like, Peanuts teacher
I'm the opposite. That's when I tune in.
That's when you tune in? That's very interesting.
Or as a storyteller.
Yeah.
But I mean, assuming that this is a point that the characters have been pursuing or kind of immersed in, and they've been trying to find out more about. Not that it's some
that's very true
out of wherever it's like, oh, this unrelated thing. Here's all this information about this thing that has nothing to do with your characters. No one cares about.
That's hard, right? But I find I have to be actively taking notes if I really want to key in on those stuff. And if the GM really wants, hey, that's the key, right? It's what comes to the table. You know, that's something in our little list that I think maybe it's out of character information, but maybe it's not secrets. Right. We should talk about secrets.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think it's a big part of it. And again, I have opinion.
Yeah.
All right. So what is the big advice? Who we were looking at videos by Thomas Flight.
Okay.
And so tell me about Show Don't Tell.
So this is like a piece of writerly advice that's kind of very often bandied about and also pretty often kind of typically misunderstood. It's like that you shouldn't, tell the characters anything. As opposed to like, basically you want to show things in the context of the world or in the context of the character's actions as much as possible. So, like in an ideal world, and the example I gave before, like, you would kind of give out pieces of, the lore about the Circle of Sendir or whatever, over the course of time. Sometimes in an RPG session, you can't do that and you have to try to, figure out how you can truncate, present it. But, it's really about showing what's relevant to that character's kind of intentions in a situation, as opposed to, what might be relevant in your mind to the sort of like larger world that might not be connected to what's happening right now,
Right. Yeah, I definitely see a trope in film, right? With the two scientists talking to one another.
Right.
And
sure, as you already know, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Yeah. And of course we were just talking about the epitome of tell, which is the voiceover. Right.
Which is a great example of you can do a voiceover really well. It's not never use a voiceover. It's that be careful when you use a voiceover.
And I think some of the more effective uses of voiceovers are when they have some sort of montage in the background.
Or they're really grounded in the character. You can learn a lot about a character from a voiceover if it's done well. And sometimes that's what's being revealed more than even what they're saying.
But in an RPG, you're not going to have montages. You're not going to have a lot of times these visual media.
Right. You won't have a visual montage.
But you and I are very much into mixed media and into, like I've been for Invisible Sun, really trying to find ways to incorporate some of that. Even to the point, spoiler alert, even to the point of hiring people as actors to provide short exposition to the players that I can then, send as a video.
We haven't done that yet.
Not yet. Almost did, except for the Harkid, the guy who was going to originally deliver that first little monologue, which was short. He decided that he just didn't have the bandwidth to be able to do it, so I didn't get him, which is a shame. But, I
hadn't played with that before.
Yeah. So it would have been a real shocker. But something to consider, like just not being your voice, quite honestly, I think can be a big boon and a big attention getter. Holy shit, this is that guy standing in front of us, kind of idea, or we're listening to them. Show don't tell. What other things? You guys are going to see a lot of props. I think props can be a big part. So it was like one of the selling points of Invisible Sun was that they were going to send us all these props. And really all they meant was we're going to have a bunch of PDFs or a bunch of printouts of, cool, thematic menus from various bars or restaurants. And, that stuff is very cool. I definitely plan on giving you guys a business card that they produced, right? So some of this stuff,
little things can ground you in your character's interaction with that thing.
But what's better than describing a magic item? What's better than describing what a book looks like or what a scroll looks like or whatever the case is, than handing the player those props?
Yeah. Yeah. This is maybe a little bit of tangent, but I love with magic items or items that are critical to the game in that way of revealing over time. Just something that, some systems lean very much away from. You want to cast your identify spell and like, okay, here's the list of things. Yeah. But like, I much prefer items that are like, have that mystery of like, well, you know this much about it. And then as time goes on, like something else happens and you learn more about it, and like sometimes that could be something, nefarious perhaps, though I'm not a fan of the cursed sword that just makes everything terrible, but like, the cursed sword that makes everything more interesting, definitely.
Well, and I sort of also dig that idea of here is a boon, but how is that boon? What are the consequences to that boon?
Right.
It's a powerful, cool magic item, but what's the problem, right? We have this really awesome, expensive sword or signet ring or something to that effect. But what happens when a member of the family sees you wielding it?
Right. Right. Well, example from the Witch Hunters campaign I'm running, one of the characters found a sword that has this crystal embedded in it. And there's a whole backstory with that. But basically, like the crystal allows this entity to speak to, people who handle it. And so for a little while, he thought this entity was dealing with actually the sword itself. The sword was intelligent, but it was actually being accessed to the crystal. And that entity started like, it was beneficial because it was ancient and had all this knowledge. But also at the same time, like it had its own motivations. And so eventually like they kind of came to heads and had to figure out how to destroy the sword. And I didn't drive the story in terms of being like, now you have to destroy the sword. That's what the player wanted to do with it,
Yeah. That's actually, you just gave me a really great idea, is the idea of not only like an entity or something like that, like Stormbringer, right? Mm-hmm. Or some, but that an idea that maybe the device, like the sword, is a scrying device.
Right. Basically, yeah.
That's really interesting, right?
Well, it's the crystal in the sword.
Yeah, it was a scrying device. Right. And I like that. I like that a lot. Feel free to use that in your campaigns, folks. Yeah.
I won't sue you.
And then, of course, art. Art is a big piece of the equation. There was a company, we'll put something in the notes once I figure out who that company was. There was a company who was producing magic item cards and NPC cards, really great art. And I just had stacks and stacks and stacks of them, where sometimes it was great to just look through the cards and be like, I love this art.
Come up with your own story about
it. And then come up with the backstory for the art. I agree with you. I think that I hate identify. Right? I mean, here is an interesting opportunity for backstory and backstory that's relevant to them. Right. Yeah. But like, it does feel so cheaty to be like, it's a +2 sword and it does this.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I try to usually, when I use this, to like either if it's like a relatively common item, that's fine. But also like if you it will kind of give you the common thing. So it might be in D&D terms like a +2 sword, but it might not necessarily be all it is. Right?
Yeah. It also sort of takes away from the idea of like a player might have like a lore skill or a history skill or something like that, where it'd be far more interesting to learn about the sword through those player interactions. Right. Instead of somebody casting identify, which, let's face it, the idea of like, what does this do and what's the history of the sword can be different, and that's fair. Mm-hmm. But it'd be far more interesting, like you said, to discover that, it almost kind of makes me go like social contract at the beginning of a campaign, being like, by the way, identified doesn't exist. Honestly, and just like, I'd much rather hand information off to the bard or the cleric, and even what I've done is, not to get too far into, but just show, don't tell, like have those characters, right, that
source. I mean, but also NPCs can serve that function too. In a lot of campaigns, I have NPCs that, hopefully it's not like the players are kind of accessing them like sort of like, this like file cabinet where they can go to the bard and be like, tell me about, this age of the world or whatever.
Right.
But still, like, that's one of the ways that NPCs can become a really, you can introduce them into the story, and like they might have their own motivations, but they might also be a source of information.
Right. And there is this fine line between is an NPC or even a PC doing that work for you still tell, right? And
depends on how you do it,
and it
right?
depends on how you do it. I think, right. So what do we feel like? So we've talked about some examples of like show what are telling, what's so what are the differences? Like what are the goals here, right? We know what transfer of information is like. We know where we're getting a sense of like show don't tell, good and bad. Like what are the goals? What are you trying to do? Obviously we're trying to entertain, right? I mean, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think, you're trying to present. The ideal is when a player and a character are seeking a particular information, because you already have, talking about social contract, you have more sort of like, permit to like, if someone's coming to you and saying, we're going to an NPC and actively saying, tell me about this thing.
Right.
It's like, you're not going to bore the players by like telling them the thing they're asking for. Right. So it is kind of, a lot of times I feel like kind of sussed out in that way of like, what are they seeking? But then this does get into the situation of what if the characters don't have the information to know what they're seeking, and then, that's kind of like the way that you can show clues. And many storytellers and DMs will know that when you, sometimes try to seed a sort of like, a path for the characters to say, oh, find this clue and find that clue. They'll inevitably miss the clues or misinterpret them in ways that can be either frustrating or really interesting. Sometimes you can kind of flip off of that and say, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. We did talk about the idea of like information that happens at the table is what's important. The idea that if someone's backstory, your world's lore, should probably not be set in stone, right? It's only when you bring it to the table that it should really have a relevance.
A lot of in-between session, either briefs of what they've done or like kind of like, if you want more information about this thing, here's a document kind of thing. But it is like kind of addendum in a way. It's not the main course, and it's not, I do like the idea of like, it being established in play kind of is where it's written,
Yeah. And that sort of stuff does. So, going into kind of character backstory and world lore, right? That kind of stuff certainly makes a world feel deep, right? Feel established, feel old. I am a huge fan of having my players convey some of that information or make up that information on the fly. But some people are a little disappointed with that.
And some players like doing that and some don't. Some want to be presented it. So that can, that's ideally, if you can assess that early on, that definitely helps make it fun for everyone.
And it is problematic when you reveal something during the game about a character. Particularly, I like doing it for stakes and roles. Some pieces of fiction, like say Total Recall, right? Where the character finds out that they're the bad guy.
Right.
And there's some players you can do that with and some players you can't. And it's like, but that wasn't part of my backstory, is one of the big pushbacks.
Yeah. And that can be a tough one depending. I've been lucky, I guess, in some ways, like especially like in recent campaigns I've run where a lot of the players seem really eager even for me to throw them curveballs in terms of their character and what's going on, but that can definitely, create a tension.
There's so many iconic moments in fiction, and again, I'm always going to use cinema as an example. Like, I Am Your Father, right? Like stuff like that is just the idea of when we were playing Blades, and it was like, that you saw the vampire and it's like, this looks like my father. Mm-hmm. It completely rewired the way you thought about this game, right? You were like, well, now I have to go back to Barsov and figure out what the hell?
What the hell's going on?
Right. You know, now on the other hand, that could also like derail idea, but to some degree, derailing is literally what we're trying to accomplish.
Right. I guess the whole issue of shaping, which is kind of a whole other thing.
So how much character backstory do you want to see? How much character backstory is ideal for you? Do you have a page count? Do you have a,
it depends on the campaign, but I do like try to base that somewhat on the player. Like some players like to write. I'm someone who like, I'll do what I do in the session, but it's always the like 3 a.m. Oh, I should have said that, or this thing is relevant to that, kind of piecing things together later. And some players are that way too, and they want to like introduce things that way, and find this. So do try to do it down to the player.
Invisible Sun has two pieces that I feel like really work well for this, and one is the idea that you started in shadow, right? Like the idea that there are bits of your life, either prior to shadow or during shadow, that you're not entirely certain what was going on.
Basically the world as we know it, right? Shadow.
Right. Yes, it's the world as we know it. And you don't know how you got there. You don't know about the war that sent you there, kind of idea. And having those gaps, having those openings, I think are really critical.
Yeah. No, I'm really fond actually of characters who at the start of the story, like, think they know who they are, but really don't.
Right.
It's kind of speaking of, reoccurring tropes and characters I play, that's probably one of them. I mean, there's various different forms of that, every character I play, but.
Do we truly know who we are?
Well, yeah. But, in terms of being a sort of big kind of reveal, and you kind of have almost your third act reveal right there,
Yeah. I'm with you. I like a character backstory can indicate to me that a player's invested in the character. Right? That can be a little troublesome in some games when the fate of the character is that question.
Yeah. I mean, like if you're playing a sort of game where it's like a dungeon crawl and someone gives you a 10-story or page backstory, it can be like, oh no, this is going to go bad.
Yeah. Like don't do that for Dungeon Crawl Classics or Call of Cthulhu, right? Those are not games where a 10-page backstory is going to serve you well.
Yeah. This is why I like the archetype approach, where you start with an archetype and you add maybe one confounding element, one thing that's not like that archetype, and then you start growing it from there. So it's like if you start the character out and they die session 1, okay, you lost an archetype. Start with a new archetype. But then if, it is true that, if you've been playing with that character for a year, it can still make you feel a certain way when your character dies. But also if you're playing an archetype mindset, you can always return to that archetype into versions that you had with it, that you're not really losing anything. You know what I mean?
Right,
like the character still quote unquote exists. Maybe not in that fiction, not in that world, but it's not like there's a rule you can never play that archetype ever again.
There's a lot of those, like when you look at something like Apocalypse World and such, where their very explicit instructions are no one else should play. No two people should play the same playbook, right? And sometimes those archetypes are definitely built in. Some games just outright have archetypes, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the ways to do a very short form character creation, right? Here is to not use the word archetype over and over again. Here is a template. There you go. There's a new word. Here is a template of what a standard character in this world will look like. Yeah. Play that to start with so that later on you could mix it up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, right? When we've been doing the actual plays for this, it's been
pre-gens, right?
Right. Yeah. It's been, we've been kind of taking that approach because we got to like learn the game, create a character, and run a session all in like how to.
Yes. For some of the games for some of the games we're going to play Cult and Unknown Armies and Hunter, The Reckoning, and those will all be pre-gens, right? A lot of the short form games are baked into what makes it a short form game.
Jump into the fiction.
Right, exactly. Anything with a playbook is probably pretty easy to jump into, right? But again, those are short form games, not campaigns, right? Where a campaign, you're almost always going to have. Nowadays, I feel like we have 2 session zeros, right? I feel like we have a character creation session. I feel like we have a world building session, depending upon the kind of game we're playing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, usually the first couple sessions is everyone's still kind of discovering their character, regardless of what system you're playing, really. At least that's my experience. Yeah.
So what are some of the ways that you have characters reveal some of that backstory? What are ways that you've brought a character's backstory, or you've allowed, I'm using big air quotes, right? Allowed them to bring into the fiction?
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's so many different situations, but the most obvious one, and it works for most situations, is where you basically give, your kind of like paragraph of information, right? That's kind of like your allotted amount of just straight exposition in my it's usually around the table. Mm-hmm. And then like you kind of role play it out. And then like as a post hoc, it's kind of like, after the session, by the way, here's more information if you're, that you like kind of the thing that you discussed, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like your characters discussed this thing. It's established on the table that you're discussing this thing, but maybe there's more information that came out of that discussion that didn't actually happen at the table that's relevant, that might be useful for you to know, either as a player or a character, which leads into the next thing of kind of like, sussing out when you, it's beneficial to give information that the player, to the player
may not know. A lot of games now, I think, appropriately have character hooks that are both either NPCs, like some sort of bond or something, or past history with a PC or an NPC.
Sure.
I think those are often can be good points where it's not that character necessarily divulging that exposition, but where there can be an interstitial scene between two characters. Particularly, the perfect example is like introductions to NPCs that are friends. Right. And is it a warm hug? How many times, does a guy get slapped, when
behavior is definitely part of exposition. I guess this is one thing we should point out, that like the typical idea of exposition is, the character is going blah, 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 blah. But what a character does can also be part of that, and that's, I guess, another way of, kind of mixing it up. If a character has a certain demeanor or whatever, that can cut by, sort of pages of them like being, like if they're really angry at the players and they don't know why, just seeing that can cut them down, like, having this sort of like big talk about it, right?
Yeah. Rings of Power, I think, was a really fun interaction between Elrond and the Dwarven prince. I can't remember his name.
Was it Darren, was it?
Is it Dern?
I can't remember. I watched the first season. We won't go into that.
I like them. And the idea that he's like upset and he's continually upset, and Elrond is trying to be magnanimous until eventually he's like, all right, I give. Why so sour? Mm-hmm. And it ends up just being because they, haven't talked to each other in a long time. It's really more world building in terms of elves live longer than everybody else, right? So that was like a really fun piece of world building. It's something that we knew, right? But still like a fun interaction. But I think I like the idea of an NPC providing exposition in terms of like, why are you angry with me? As if like maybe they forgot, or maybe it wasn't as big of a deal to the PC as it was to the NPC, right, or something to that effect.
Sure.
How did you feel? We just had our first session of Invisible Sun.
Right.
One thing about Invisible Sun that was a challenge was the idea that there's a lot of spells.
Yeah.
There are hundreds upon, I think it's like 400 cards, at least 200 of them are spells. And it's not like D&D, can be pretty easy in that regard, in that you have a very finite list of things that you can cast at first level.
Right.
You get first level spells, right? Yeah. That's not how many of these other fantasy games go. And so now it's a matter of, do you know more powerful spells? They just might be more difficult to cast. Yeah. And that becomes a decision-making process
How much do you want to risk?
For characters, right? So in that, now you just have this, do you make a player dig through all of those spells to determine this is what I want to start with.
Yeah, I like the fact that you didn't just do a straight randomization, because some systems do that where you just like roll 2d6 or whatever.
Torchbearer.
Right.
Do you start with these relics? These relics say what spells you
Which
have.
is, okay, I think Torchbearer, it's probably okay. But, it's still like you've had it so that we kind of chose whether it was for our character or for someone else's, and gave like sort of the plot hook sort of for how, that was relevant to them.
How was it relevant? So what I did was I went through, for 4 characters, everybody is going to start with X number of spells. Generally, everybody can start with like 2 or 3 spells. And what I did is I took spells that I thought were interesting, probably within the same power level of the game, and then split them up. So their first session, there was a being who was messing with everybody's memories and perceptions of things and such. So what I did was I mixed up the spells and said, look, these are all of your spells, and many of you realize you don't remember what spells you had. And so now what we're going to do is each player goes around the table as you're exploring this, and there'll be moments where you can draw from the pile. And when you draw from the pile, you look at the spell, you read the spell, determine, is this a spell that I had, or is this a spell someone else had? And if it is, either way, you describe to the group what the memory is associated with that spell. Right? Whether it be something around that spell, something evocative of that spell, or whatever the case is. Did anybody keep their own?
I don't think so.
I think everybody gave a memory out to another player.
So I wasn't tracking it, but I think that's right.
So what that did was it not only gave everybody an interesting number of spells that I thought were thematically within line of the campaign, but also gave the players something to sort of explore and play with. And it also gave them a little tidbit into their characters, right? That were derived generally from other players. And, just to remind you, my whole idea is whatever comes to the table can be challenged by anybody, and the dice can decide. So the players could have said, no, that was not how the memory went. It actually went this way, and rolled. Right. No one did. Everybody was actually pretty happy with the inclusion to their backstory. But I always want that thing, because I don't want, talking about player agency, right? I don't want a player to feel like a backstory is being thrust upon them that they weren't expecting. So this gives them some social contract. I feel like everybody would have felt worse if they didn't have that option, but having that option just allowed them to maybe relax a little.
With the people kind of dictating the character for you. Yeah.
Right.
Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate? What vast cannibal hunger?
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Discover more about the myth-punk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com.
So what's the next part of the
World
War? World War. Yeah.
War. So, we are, much to our player chagrin, we are writers.
Right. Yeah. I think you probably talk about, because I say oftentimes I take a writer's room approach, and I can flesh out what that means a little bit. But
Yeah. How do you want to see that play out? I think,
Right.
I think that we can talk about the challenges of that approach, but I'm with you. I really love approaching games conceptually.
Yeah,
right.
I think a big part of it is you have to be at a point with the group you're playing with that you can make a sort of strong division between player and character knowledge, and you kind of trust the players not to be like, I'm going to try to take advantage of this within the context of the game to gain a benefit for my character, as opposed to like, I'm going to use this information to try to create a more interesting kind of story, or throw a twist to someone else that they don't expect, whatever it is.
Can you give me an example of how you think maybe somebody would utilize information that would be problematic?
Where, my character doesn't know this thing, but since I know this thing, I'm going to take this action,
I feel, I think usually my approach to that sort of stuff is, and again, we talked about the idea that like a lot of people think metagaming and
it's kind of metagaming thing
is a bad thing. I don't.
Right.
I like to use that stuff to push players towards those things, right? So I want a proactive game. I want proactive players. And if, let's just say one character is actually there to, let's just say, kill another character, right? Just use an example.
An assassin who's something.
An assassin,
right? Sure.
Right? The game becomes more interesting to me. I mean, I think to everybody, in my opinion, it becomes more interesting if the players know that about the characters.
Yeah.
And then what I allow the target to do is to find a way to discover that through usually rolls.
Right.
So it feels more contrived than it being this big surprise, but I'm far more an advocate of suspense than I am thrills.
Yep.
Right. So I will tell the player that there's the briefcase with the bomb under the table.
Right.
Right. And have them try to figure out, how does my character discover that? Now granted, they could be like, I look under the table. Okay, well, you see briefcase, what do you do with it? I don't know. I think that's more either that, or it'd be like something pulls you away, right? Or something to that effect. I'd much rather use that information to allow for the game to be proactive and to suss that stuff out than to be things they don't or can't find.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
I do push back with a lot of, I guess I could see using it poorly would be I know my friend is not here because they're sick or they couldn't make it to game.
Right. Yeah,
and then I'm going to do something against them knowing they can't retaliate.
Right. Yeah, that would be.
Right. That's kind of crappy.
Very crappy way of using it.
Player information. Right. Or, quite honestly, if it, sometimes it can be used poorly, but like the thing that I think really frustrates a lot of us is, well, I know the monster manual inside and out, and I know this creature, I know how many hit points it has. It doesn't hold any challenge to me. Right. Right? I know what's more interesting.
It doesn't hold any mystery is probably the...
No, right, yeah. Well, it's both things. Yeah. It's I have no pathos in this encounter because I know it's easy.
Yeah, or to be into this thing or into that.
Right. Or like a good example of that is the troll. Everybody knows that you said troll's a light, right? But it'd be fun if like you cut the thing in half. But
here's a good example of lore, right? Because if a character, this is one of the places where a ranger is supposed to be a rewarding character class that arguably doesn't work out as well as it, but like where they say, I know this about this thing, you guys don't, and the player tells them that, or it has to be an NPC, but like that. So like that can be a way that you can kind of reveal that information in game, but the conflict between like, you want to play the game well and you want to know the game and so on and use the game to play it quote unquote well. But then, right. Yeah, exactly.
Where you get your fun from.
Right. But if it kind of reduces the fiction down to just that, and you're trying to create a game where the fiction is where things happen, that creates a problem, or can.
Right. And right. We're not speaking to the people who are playing the tactical game.
Right. Yeah. You're playing like a focus on miniatures game, and it's all that's what you're doing.
Right.
So
100%. Right. But so there's two approaches that I feel like are better than, all right, we kill it and we send it alight. Right. Two approaches. One would be the cinematic approach, where the characters get into some conversation, the GM digs into loot. What do you find? What do you learn about this? Right. And then behind the characters, the troll stands up. Right. Now there's two of them because you cut them in half, kind of idea. That's, or the scene in, I'm trying to think like some sort of learning Hydra, right? Where, now it grows its head back, and you watch it horror as it grows its head back.
Yeah, having the trolls rise and stuff. It's like now the characters know that about trolls.
Now the characters know that about trolls. The second way to do that, particularly for the gamist who is like, I know this information and I don't want to sit on the information.
Right.
And I also don't want to gloat. I don't want to be like, oh, I know, but go ahead, you do what you do, right? You could be like, if you're not the ranger, you could be like, hey, by the way, does your ranger know this? I don't know. Let me find out. Or the GM says yes.
Yeah. Or tie it into your own backstory. Why do you know that? Yeah.
Sure. But,
in the game, I mean.
But it's more interesting. I always tell people, like, as a player, your role is to make other people look awesome.
Right.
That's my
musicians in a band, too. Like the best guitarist, best bassist, best
Absolutely.
Always make me feel like I'm a better player and whatever I'm playing. Yeah.
And so I'm always much more interested in enabling other people and having them enable me than me being cool. Right. And so I always try to, that's why I think that would be the best.
I mean, it depends. Like knowing if your character is like, like a traveling monk or something, maybe they know about trolls, even though they're not a ranger, whatever.
Right.
But
now, the third way that the kinds of games we've been playing lately are a flashback.
Right.
Where now the player says, is there some weakness of trolls that I should know about?
Right.
Is there something that I know about this that I can bring in and be like, okay, well, at one point in time, you faced a troll, you stand.
I'm happy you mentioned that because flashbacks are another example of ways to kind of do the show, don't tell thing is to like basically cut back to when you discovered this thing
and actually play it out.
Right.
You roll. If it's a failed roll, then no, you don't. And then you do the cinematic version where two trolls stand behind the party.
Sure.
So I think those are better approaches or more interesting approaches, like you said, if you want story to lead.
Yeah.
And
to kind of get back to the like writer's room approach, right?
Yeah.
So like I think like a storyteller, right, is kind of the showrunner, except you have to be careful because they don't have the same sort of control, and that's the system is kind of what changes. It's like a writer's room, but you're playing to the system at the same time, or within the context of the system, and that's kind of what's fascinating about RPGs to me. When it comes down to it, is that you have this dynamic of writers who each have kind of primary control of a character, but then also kind of secondary control of the world. And then you have like a showrunner who has primary control of the world, but secondary control of, well, not necessarily the player character, but NPCs in the world. Right. And then at the same time, there are rules that can kind of like flip those things around, or the outcome of a dice roll can flip those things around. So that's usually, I think, the way I frame it. I'm not saying this is the way that everyone should do it, or even the way I always do it, but
sure,
kind of how I think about it.
And let's talk also just briefly about external resources I think both of us, we're using World Anvil
Sometimes,
for Witch Hunters now, right? Those sorts of wikis. I love every single
wikis are good.
game.
I use Google Docs a lot.
Google Docs?
It's simple and
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I use Discord now more than anything.
Same. Yeah.
So you'll, how do you feel about, honestly, no pressure, like on air,
Right.
how do you feel about the use of threads and channels in Discord for Invisible Sun?
I think I like it for the most part. I mean, I think that like critical lore, you kind of want to like copy and save somewhere else, just because things get buried in threads, even if you do split them up.
Even if you split them up,
if it's like a really important thing, it's like you want to have it somewhere. So there's that. And the only other challenge can be buy-in in terms of like, and this is just a general problem of the day we live in, where it's like, I have friends who respond, I know from habit that they'll respond if I message them on Facebook Messenger, but they won't respond if I text them. And the people who respond, same with Discord. It's like some people like buy into Discord right away, and some people it's kind of hard to get them on that level. And then you have information that you have to kind of present to them who don't get engaged with Discord as much, so that's kind of a practical challenge with it. I found in my own experience trying to run it. When you're playing online, it kind of almost reduces that a little bit, because you kind of have to use something like Discord to have a chat.
Well, I will tell you right now, and this is a big secret.
Okay. I guess not if we're recording it.
Well, but the question is at what point in time will people learn about
right,
this?
Sure.
And as a player, I will let you know that there are some things buried in Discord for the players to find. Like I am creating this alternative media, not at the table,
right,
for you to be able to interact with certain things in Discord.
I mean, at least it's a very interesting experiment.
Yeah, so we'll see how that works. But I'm letting you know how much you want to go down that rabbit hole, you'll see. But there are some very interesting things that you can discover through that stuff.
Yeah.
There's been a couple attempts. I don't know that they've been successful. There's been a couple attempts to do websites that are more interactive.
Right. That was a big thing in like the 2000s for sure. And I was kind of involved with that with the ARG movement and stuff. But it's gotten a little less.
So there was this game back in the day, which is funny because of what it means now, but it was called Metaverse. It's a 90s RPG that really tried to embrace some of that new technology. Flopped terribly. It didn't really have any big company behind it. So, I don't know what else, but there's been, there was, I'll keep mentioning just because it's on my brain. It's what I work on. It's sort of like, the big game for me right now, which is Invisible Sun.
Sure.
But if you know anything about it, if you look into it, you'll find that there is actually a Google Doc of secrets where community members have dug in to try to find all of the various crazy stuff that's in Invisible Sun. Like there's symbolism and what do the various little glyphs mean? Because of course they mean everything. Right. Talking about creating our own languages. There are links and stuff like that you can like sift through and find various pieces of information. Go to websites that are just these random websites if you know how to get to them, that convey secrets within the world.
Yeah, I used to get really into that, both for ARGs and RPGs. I like making in-world websites.
Right.
I don't do that as much as I used to, but
you know what I did for Alien is I created a Discord bot for Alien called Mother.
Right. That was like the ship's AI.
Yeah. And allowed the players like a limited scope to be able to interact with Mother, just like you did in the ship. And then it was in a channel where everybody could see it. So it wasn't just for that player, but it's like, the ominous answers that Mother would give to various questions,
Yeah.
Especially in the world of AI. I want to bring up, and I want you to talk about, because
I have so much to say about it that's hard to...
I want you to talk about this because you brought it to my attention. I think it's pretty amazing. And I think somehow we can use it, is Notebook LM.
Okay.
Because
it's not quite there yet at least with the podcast side of it, but the little test thing that you can do with it already is kind of fascinating.
I'm thinking of it in terms of like how you could use it to convey lore.
Right. Yeah, like two newscasters or whatever kind of in world who are talking about a thing.
Right.
Actually, in the 2054 campaign, most newscasters were AI. It's funny, we ran it in 2020, and like now we're already starting to see that in some places. But so like it would make total sense then to have these two, like even if they are like apparently AI, which is kind of already sort of like you can kind of tell but kind of can't. But like still, like it makes sense. You're right. Yeah, like I love having things like that are in world. Like especially like when it comes to AI, it's like it makes a lot of sense to use it in a cyberpunk campaign because that's like it's kind of part of the lore,
right? And to some degree, you did that, right?
Yeah. No, it was kind of funny that they it was able to pull. See, with Witch Hunters and a lot of campaigns I run when they're story based, I keep pretty meticulous notes that include like briefing, basically a brief of what happened every session. So it winds up being a lot of material for it to draw on because you have like 22 sessions of.
I want to be better at that, but yeah.
I did it. I started doing it with 2054. I started doing it more as a bullet point sort of thing, and it's kind of expanded from there. But and part of it is just because both players and storyteller, all of us don't have perfect memory. We don't have eidetic memory as a trait, and so it helps to be able to look back. And there are some built-in ways of like, one of the players like gives a recounting of last session and stuff. But that can sometimes it can be great, especially if they can do it in character. But it's like it can also feel onerous, like oh no. It's my turn, I can't remember, so it's very useful to have those notes to be like, okay, here's the notes. And then you can give them the chance of like, do you want to recount that, right. But what you're recounting, trying to like cover up for the fact that you can't remember what happened last week.
So Notebook LM is basically you just look it up, Google Notebook LM, and it can hold up to 50 documents, I believe, right? And then you just click generate after you load this document.
For the podcast sample thing.
And these two people just start talking about whatever it is that you loaded in. It's really, really interesting, particularly like players who might have a little shorter attention span, or maybe it's a format that they're used to engaging in. Maybe another way to deliver some of your content.
Yeah, and world media is great. And I mean, there's a whole other conversation to have about AI and like ways that it can be used and not. But just to focus on one piece of it, like my personal feeling is like within a private game, like I don't see what the issue is, really, like beyond using any technology, it's like to share, images of NPCs or PCs or a setting piece or whatever. Previously, I would, go into Pinterest and grab something, 100%. But it's not like, I was, or have the funds to like, pay a bunch of a staff of freelance artists to illustrate my private campaign. Like it's not a thing.
I've always been so jealous of those, envious, I should say, of those game masters who had artists. Players.
Sure, and I am an artist, but even still, like I don't have the time to spend 30 hours on a digital painting, each of the characters, or like especially for like this session. Here's an NPC. I spent all week drawing it. You better like it.
That is a whole other ball of wax.
Exactly.
That is the thing. So we've gone through a lot of this stuff. We're almost to the end here. So out of character information, I think we probably covered most of how we think about that. Did you have anything to add before we move on to perception?
Go back to the example that I had before of the Witch Hunters campaign where people didn't catch what was happening until the end, where some of the people in the circus got kidnapped. I had a kind of, not dilemma, but like I knew I could go two ways with it. I could leave a completely blank slate, and like then the next session is probably going to be them trying to figure out what the hell happened. But I wanted to move things along. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But so I had a note left where they were taken, which kind of filled in not all the blanks, but it filled in enough of the blanks to say, okay, they were taken by these people, and like this thing must have happened in the background, and still like a short note. It wasn't like a huge piece of exposition, but that changes the whole sort of next session of what they're going to do. Now they know, like, our friends have been taken there in this jail. We're supposed to show ourselves there in the morning. What are we going to do?
Right. You're saying you've you created kind of a fail safe, right? And you could do that with a journal. You could do that with an NPC who maybe saw it from the shadows. You could
kind of filling in some of the blanks of what they missed that's still relevant to their characters, and it's kind of like directing where they're going to go next without telling them how the characters are going to react to that situation. It's just they have this information now they didn't have before.
Yeah. I definitely think the leaving it open, like just leaving that information blank, can be problematic. Can actually be more problematic, right? So some people are just like, well, if you failed the roll, right? Which I don't necessarily believe in. We'll get into that, but. A good example, and I'm going to give a very controversial opinion here. A good example is Game of Thrones. Is that I contend that the people who were surprised by Daenerys's actions at the end were not paying attention.
I mean, I agree. For all my other issues with the late seasons, that decision made that's just part of the.
And I think there was so much nerd rage about her ending, like what she did at the end. And I was like screaming at them, being like, we saw this the entire time. Like there's no way this was not the inevitable end.
Sure. Plus the whole like kind of, the Targaryen family and like sort of what you know about that. And,
well, that's what I mean. It's like I just don't think you were paying attention. If you didn't know what's going on. And I don't mean to be like blunt about it, but I feel like that's a same situation where I think you end up being butthurt when something comes up and the GM especially is like, well, this thing happened and I guess you missed it, or something like that, where, on the other hand, there is a danger to backups, right? Mm-hmm. The danger to backups being players become complacent.
Well, yeah, they feel like they don't have to, like it doesn't matter if they find the thing or whatever, because it's going to be supplied to them.
Right.
Although, again, that's like, kind of like the, buy-in of the group you're playing with and, knowing your players, I know my players kind of want to get a certain thing out of it in most of the games I'm running, so I'm not too worried about that.
Yeah.
If anything, the complaint, if you want to call it that I get is like that you're not being hard enough on us. But some of that is actually just like this is one player who really wants his characters to sort of like. She does alchemy and she's getting into necromancy. She does dangerous stuff, right? So there can be repercussions to that if she always rolls 5+ success. And it does fit into her character because she's kind of this sort of like, savant character in terms of what she does with that. But still, it's like, I really want to like not be worse at this, but like I want those repercussions to come into the story, and the dice keep not letting it happen almost,
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Like sometimes I'll have like really interesting, complex stakes in my head, and then the players just succeed at all those rolls. And okay, I guess I don't know what to do with those.
Yeah, I think we had a fair session like that where like for the whole session for some reason we just kept rolling sick, whatever. Like it's just like, oh my god.
Right, it's like the game state is such now you're like, all right, well that happened. I have to you kind of feel bad because you're like, now I have to like figure out how to make it not so easy, right? But
without making it like penalizing for having a success, which you also don't want to do.
Right, which you don't want to do. Yeah. That's the worst thing in the world. You can't go against what the dice say, in my opinion.
You can interpret them in different ways, but
interpret them in different ways. But I think it's the death knell of a game when GMs fudge dice.
This is one reason why sometimes rolling a GM, in my opinion, a GM rolling privately can be beneficial because a lot of the fudging dice thing is whether they know you're fudging dice.
Well, I mean, that is true. Again, being that sort of cult of personality GM, right? Part of that idea is thinking that, and this is not a judgment, right? I don't want you to think that I'm saying this is a judgment. This is a viable way to run fun games. I don't think it's a sustainable way to run fun games.
Well, it's not something you can drop that system into 100 different groups and you're going to get similar results.
And you'll get the same result. But there is a sense of, I know what is going to be fun. Right. I know the kind of experience I'm trying to deliver. And if my players are on board with accepting that experience, then go for it.
Yeah.
Right. Then be the storyteller. Be the person who's driving that story. Right. I used to be that, right? But I now really look for that fun coming from my players and surprising me and such. But that being said, I think there's a couple of ways to combat the ideas and the concerns, sort of moving into this idea of the perception check, right? One of the ways I think was handled by Trail of Cthulhu very well, and it's a model that I try to use often. It's not, interestingly enough, even though we're in our horror series, we're not going to play Trail of Cthulhu. Interestingly enough, I don't think we're going to get to any
there's just so many games. We could probably spend a year playing horror games if we wanted to.
Yeah, I think the closest one I probably want to get in, because I know you want to play Coriolis. I definitely want to run Coriolis. And Coriolis is my go-to horror game,
right?
And it has a lot of Lovecraftian sort of feelings to it. So that being said, Trail of Cthulhu, what they do is you have a dice pool, and part of that, sometimes you can use it for dicey things, but other times you can just spend them, right, to get information. So what you're doing is you're investing in this scene. So you might be like, okay, well, I'm going to invest 1. And then you get level 1 of information.
I like that.
I'm going to invest 2. I'm going to get level 2 information. And all of their scenarios, including a bunch of the stuff that I've written for them, all of their scenarios then have that idea of level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, right?
In a meta sense, it's kind of like a perception check that was like more gradients of ways of engaging with it.
Right. And then the player is the one who's in control. Right. Because the reality is, and their conceit, and I agree with this conceit 100%, is a failed perception check is garbage. It doesn't really hold any good quality in a game. Like, you can maybe have a little bit of a corner case where sometimes something the player doesn't know might be more interesting. Right. But more times than not, it's only interesting to the GM.
Right. I mean, they have to find out about sometime. I mean, it can be interesting to not know something is a mimic when you walk in the room, but if you walk out of the room and don't engage with it, it doesn't matter that it was a mimic.
Right. Exactly. And so a good way, for instance, in your example, I think how you handled it was fine, but I think another possibility there would be the level 1 input in this scene of they find the note. Right. And so now if no one invests in a scene, well, fuck them. Like, that was their fault, right? But if you get a invisible sun, it's hidden knowledge. I like to use hidden knowledge for this, right? I'm going to spend hidden knowledge to either say what happened or get information out of GM.
Right? Yeah, because a failed perception check, is what you're saying, is basically like, not a dead end, but nothing happens.
Right. Nothing happens. Right. Yeah. And now if you're running with a stake system, right, a system of implicit or explicit consequences to all failed rolls, which I do, then that failed roll is definitely going to push something. Very often what it will mean is you learn the information anyway, you just get a disadvantage.
Right. Or something happens from you finding that out. You put your ear to the door, but then I don't know, hear you doing whatever.
Right. Particularly for horror, what'll happen is usually you lose sanity. Usually it's like what you discover you didn't want to discover, you know?
That's so that's dynamic.
That's sort of like one way to think about it. There are 2 ways, right? So stakes are a big part of that. It's some sort of investment system, right? Is always used.
Yeah, and then there's it's called passive perception in D&D or 5e, but like it's something that's kind of implicit in a lot of other systems where it's like a character has a certain skill or whatever. Sometimes you roll it, but sometimes it's like even just like, oh, I know this character has like an occult before or whatever, so I'm going to, present this information to them that that other people wouldn't notice based on that. And that's kind of like a version of passive perception. It's that character is really good at this thing, so they would know this that other people don't know.
Right. Just include it. You don't need them to roll. They roll it down. So the third way, which is probably one of my favorite ways, but in some groups might not have it, is the players make those decisions. So when we talk about mystery games, we're going to talk about a format of mystery game where basically the players are driving what the actual truth of the mystery is.
Right.
That there's almost like a clue quality to what's going on in their roles, and their table chatter is me scribbling, being like, well, clearly, Professor Mustard killed him with because that's what the players are telling me. Mm-hmm. A good example of this is secret doors. I like using Dungeon World's form of secret doors, which is, yes, there are maps, fine, whatever. If a player searches for a secret door and they succeed, then there's a secret door. Otherwise, I assume there's not a secret door, right? So secret doors aren't a thing of this is written on a map, right? But more to the point of a means for them to discover a quick escape, a way to loot, things like that.
Sure.
If they don't discover one, then usually the stakes are maybe they do discover a secret door, but there's a problem, right?
Something inside of it.
There's nothing, right? Or there's a trap goes off.
Right.
There's most likely what happens. They take damage, or they're surprised by a monster on the other side of the secret door, or something to that effect. A good example of that is that the party goes to a dead end. It's probably obvious there's a secret door. It's really not, again, I always say this, it doesn't matter that you find it. It doesn't matter if you can get to it. What matters is on the other side. What matters is your intent. So digging into that intent, I think is the important part of those. Is there any other piece of that you feel is another approach that you've tried or you can think of might?
How do you feel about handouts?
No, that's a really good. I love handouts. So something I wanted to mention earlier that we didn't really talk about is I often source. So I was an educator for the longest time. I often source educational techniques, right, in terms of like flipped classrooms. So if you're not aware, what a flipped classroom is where you basically send the students out to find their own information, and then they do presentations to the class, right? So, and the teacher sometimes might have to fill in some of the gaps, but by and large, all of that information is coming from other students.
That's really interesting. It's because we were talking before we started recording, and we're probably going to talk again about, the ways that like discovering a character as an actor is very similar to what you're doing in an RPG. The differences come in more in terms of like how or if it's a performance. But so you can get a lot of information, a lot of methods from acting techniques in terms of discovering character. But also from the classroom, and methods that are used in classrooms are really useful too. And I think that's something we both kind of obviously do it implicitly, but I'd like to, as part of this podcast, to explore more is, all the sources of information and styles that come from things that aren't RPGs, that aren't like an RPG cast or whatever, that are still relevant, and sometimes can really freshen things up in a way to think about it in that way.
I really for instance, I'm going to be running a Infinity campaign, obviously Invisible Sun. We have a number of different games. We're doing some, obviously Chronicles of Darkness.
Right.
And a lot of times what I'll do is I will make a list of source material, and, film is a lot more accessible to me right now. I do a lot of reading.
Yeah, I watch it. Especially since 2020.
A lot of my reading ends up being sort of more nonfiction oriented, right? So I do read some fiction, but that's how I separate my brain, is that my reading is in my nonfiction, and my fiction is in the visual media. And I'll write as many, I've been watching as many spy films as I possibly could to run a spy game in Infinity, right? Or, we had the hardest time thinking about what kind of genre is Invisible Sun?
Yeah.
And what do we source in terms of like the experience we're trying to deliver with it.
Yeah, especially if you try to get past the sort of default, like 3 or 4 or 5, like kind of like almost obvious ones,
right?
Dark City, whatever, and you kind of like, I don't know what else.
Once we got past Dark City and Sandman, now we're like, all right, now we're really digging deep, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly.
So this idea of a flipped classroom, I think, is really valuable, and it does allow for your players to get tidbits of lore, right? And allow them to deliver the lore, right? And sometimes I'll even, quite honestly, like I'll even seed that to them in emails or whatever beforehand. Be like, just so you know, this might come up in the game today. And they'll read it and they'll be like, well, I don't know how. And they'll be like, oh, every once in a blue moon, I'm disappointed that I have to be like, and then like elbow them, and they'll be like, oh, right. I'm less engaged or less, I think it's less fun when the player then just pulls out whatever I gave them and reads it verbatim.
Right. Yeah.
I feel
you
like
want them to interpret it.
I like them to interpret it, you know.
Yeah, no, and I find that works 9 times out of 10. I mean, I think the only thing for me sometimes, and this is probably just in general with like kind of player-driven games, where as a player, it's like 9 times out of 10, like, especially if they start to develop a sense of the character, it's like, I at least know how they're going to react to something or whatever. But like, sometimes I feel put on the spot, especially early on, where it's like, what's your character or whatever, you're like, I don't know my character yet. I know they're a troll.
Absolutely.
Like, so, and you want to push people to kind of develop that. So it's good. It's, that's the only time where I feel sometimes like, man, I don't know. And then you kind of pull like just kind of whatever comes to mind. Sometimes it's not the best thing, But,
I don't know is not, it's not never a right answer, but sometimes I find myself when they're like, I don't know, I'm like, this is the point.
Well, yeah, I know.
Like,
exactly.
This is why I'm asking. Yeah. I know you don't know.
Yeah, it usually means like your brain's blank.
Right. My son does that. I like ask him, so what do you think of this? I don't know. Okay, so maybe that's the point to engage, right? Yeah. We all have brain farts at the time, but just because that's very often, and if I don't tell them ahead of time, if it's not a handout, right? When we talk about props, right? That's just another prop. God, I've always wanted to just write a book for an RPG. Write a book that's in game, right? And just hand it to them. Yeah, like go to town.
We were joking about that earlier.
I absolutely am going to do it at some point in time. I might be fucking 80 years old when I get it done, but I'm going to do it. We've been talking about a project for Blades that I want to be like system agnostic of creating this book and this art book and this idea where then how can you engage with it in various ways. And the key there sort of has to do a lot with this conversation is I want props, or I want a means for the players to engage with something in game, the characters and players, that I'm not the source. I am the source, but I'm not the source, right? Again, that I want the players to inform the other players, And if it comes from me, from like, giving them a little snippet, a paragraph or whatever, that's fine. So that's necessary, right? But it's much more satisfying for everybody. It's an immersion for me, for them. And then, of course, the other way to do that is to ask them to come up with it, right? That's what you're saying. Like, well, I don't know what my character would think about that. But try to be like, who was the tyrant before the current king? You tell me. Oh, well, it was my great-grandfather. Fantastic, that adds whole new elements.
I guess one thing to tag on to this is knowing, like keeping track of what NPCs and players know in game kind of as part of the lore thing. And this can be sometimes a little challenging, I found, especially as a campaign that's been going on for a while. We get to a point where you're like 20 sessions in and it matters what this organization that they're like trying to investigate or fight against knows about them or whatever, you know, but you're like trying to keep track of that. Like, when would they know that the players did this? When would the players know that this NPC behind the scenes, especially if you're a villain who's been, you know, like Act 1 and 2, the big villain might be almost completely behind the scenes, you know, so like, how do they know about what they're doing behind the scenes, you know, and you can introduce that through some of the techniques we've talked about so far, but I think that is one of the challenges that can arise in this.
Some background knowledge and talking about things like when fiction comes to the table. One of the things that I've noticed that I use for that is hit clocks. Right. Yeah. So that idea in Apocalypse World that says, or Powered by the Apocalypse, of like the GM can push back with on failed rolls, right? Like, there's a gradient. You don't go from 0 to harm, right, with one roll, right? The idea is that you build up and with warnings. But it's same thing for like NPCs, even in the background. I'll have a hit clock for you know, a shady organization. Right. And when they make failures, I'll be like, all right, well, you get what you want. But then what happens
is track of,
I advance the hit clock, and then I find some way. Sometimes it's cinematic. Sometimes it's like, you know, the big bad NPC is wringing his hands and be like, I see what they're doing, you know, or something dumb like that. I don't know. But so sometimes you can warn them about that, you know, sometimes, but sometimes you show them the hit clock and you color it in. Right. And they're like, well, what does that mean? Right?
You'll find out.
You'll find out. You know? And then the reason I like that is because then they're like engaged and being like, well, we need to find out what that was. Right. And I think that's a different mindset, right? And the idea of like, I shouldn't use information. And we're trying to say you should. We're trying to say push towards that meta information. Just do it in game. Right. I mean, the ideal is that like it's like kind of doled out over the course of the whole campaign would be like the sort of that information, as opposed to, you know, the sort of, I mean, we're talking about giving players a book, so I don't know. You know, in general, I would say, you know, on session 1, you can give people like enough context to play in the world that they're trying to create. But if you knew everything in advance, then why are you playing? You know, one more thing, and I'm not saying we should finish here, but one more thing that I've done that I think is pertinent is when you have a bigger piece. A book is a very good example and it's a challenging example because there's a clear departure between what the character's doing and what the player's doing, right? The character's clearly reading through this book. So we have this journal of a necromancer in our Torchbearer game, right? And 2 of the characters can read it, or trying to.
They're learning languages so they can read it,
They're learning languages so they can read it, which is part of it, right? And part of the lore. But consequently, what I do is I make certain books like that actually have in-game advantages. And a lot of times it's in-game advantages for like lore checks or history checks or something.
And a lot of systems will like give you a way to do that, or like give you dice towards something or whatever.
Exactly. So then it becomes pertinent to whatever the narrative is at the time. And they may be coming from me, but they're very interested in that lore now, right? That I've spent hours writing, because I've given them a bonus, right? And now they're like, oh, well, now it's time that I'm sitting around the fire. I open it up. I'm going to read what I might find out. Well, roll and see how you do, right? And then consequently, it does allow me, within the idea that they're taking time reading this, it does allow me to dole out that information over time, right? Sometimes I'll even give that information at like the end of a session. By the way, in the time that you've read this book, here's a little bit of what you learned, right? And again,
that's usually how I
do find players are more engaged and engaging with it when it's like, this is what my character actually read, right? Or some summarization of it to get back to your original sort of inclusion, right?
Yeah.
Anything else?
I think this was a pretty good conversation.
Yeah.
As always, there are topics we'll keep returning to in different forms, but, we could probably just sit here and rip off of each other for 5 hours and then, there's your episode. Everyone have fun. But no, I think that's nothing to digest.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
Okay, crazy girl. Tell me something really strange. I want to know right away. Better than unleashing the crazy bit by bit. I stopped and stared into her eyes, but only saw my reflection in them. Well, I'm a witch. Kind of. Who isn't these days? She said, shrugging. No, I mean, my grandfather is a spirit who records the stories of the dead, but my grandmother stole his magic. She's dead. Dead. But she's also not dead. Also, I can talk to birds. We just met, she said helplessly. Is this something you do often? No. I don't have many friends. You're pretty, so if that's true, you must be real weird.
You could discover more about the myth-punk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis.